Ever feel like you're just drowning in information, but you're not actually understanding things any better?
Totally. Like you want the real story, the global picture, but without needing a PhD to decode it all.
Exactly. And that's pretty much what we're diving into today. We're looking at a project called Voices of the World.
Yeah, it's this amazing collection of perspectives, basically interviews gathered from people all over the globe.
Yeah.
Gives you a real sense of, lived experiences.
Right. And it's not just the interviews themselves. We're looking at fictional stories inspired by them, set everywhere from like Michigan, New Mexico to Kenya, Panama, Kolkata, Nepal.
And the research behind it all, too. Documentaries, books, the whole lot.
So our mission here really is to pull out the biggest themes, the most surprising bits from Voices of the World.
We want to give you those kind of aha moments, that click of understanding, but keep it focused.
Okay, let's jump in. What actually sparked this whole Voices of the World project in the first place?
Well, the main driver was this desire to tell the stories of people whose struggles often don't make the headlines, but their experiences are so crucial to understanding the world.
So stories that often go unheard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was influenced by, literature, personal accounts, looking at how everything from really personal stuff like family issues to bigger things like governments or social status, how all that shapes lives.
And it's key to remember, these short stories, they're fiction, right? But based on real research, real observations.
Absolutely. Grounded in reality. And Voices doesn't pull any punches. It tackles huge global social justice issues. We're talking poverty billions living on less than $4 a day.
Wow.
Sex trafficking, which is part of this like massive modern slavery problem.
Yeah.
Over 40 million people. Plus lack of education, malnutrition.
So the goal is really twofold then. Give these people a voice, but also get us talking about these really critical current issues.
Precisely. Spark conversation.
Okay, so how on earth did they actually gather all these voices? It sounds like a massive logistical challenge, keeping it authentic and diverse.
Oh, it was incredibly complex, but also really thoughtfully done. What really struck me was their approach to language right from the start.
How so?
Well, they drafted the interview guides in the author's native languages first, then translated them to English for the whole group to review.
That shows real respect, doesn't it? Trying to avoid just a Western viewpoint.
Totally. And they had this shared online document for defining terms, making sure everyone was on the same page, culturally and linguistically. Like, any changes needed, the whole group's okay.
That collaborative approach must have been vital.
Definitely. And they didn't just jump in. They used draft templates, did mock interviews on different platforms, Skype, phone, whatever, worked just to practice and refine things.
Lots of prep work.
A lot.
Yeah.
Even reaching out to people initially was done carefully, respecting local ways of doing things. It built this sense of shared ownership, but it also meant, information flowed pretty freely within the team.
And the actual participants, how were they chosen?
They aimed for a real mix. Different cultural backgrounds, of course, but also different age groups, genders, geographic locations, trying to get the widest possible range of ideas.
And how many ended up participating?
The final sample was 8 volunteers from various countries. The interviews themselves were semi-structured. They had core questions, but let the conversation flow.
So more of a conversation than just ticking boxes.
Right. And they used native speakers for translation when needed, which is crucial for catching those nuances, nonverbal stuff too.
Makes sense.
Then all the recordings were transcribed, checked, double-checked, and they looked for themes. And importantly, they used fake names to protect everyone's privacy.
Good. And the questions themselves, what were they trying to get at?
Initially, they used a framework focused on people's relationship with nature. Like, how do you see your place in nature? Are humans different from nature? Can we control it? Stuff like that.
Interesting angle. Trying to understand core worldviews.
Yeah, exactly. And they had follow-up questions ready, probing questions, but they really stressed it should feel like a conversation, adapting as they went.
Right, not rigid. And wasn't there an earlier group they worked with back in 2015?
Yes, that's right. That was a smaller group, 10 people under 40, musicians, arts managers, academics, from places like Argentina, Brazil, France, Malaysia, Singapore.
A specific kind of group?
Yeah, they describe them as powerful women rooted in multiple landscapes, people involved in arts, education, activism. And a key thing was they were willing to keep journals or video logs.
Rooted in multiple landscapes. That's evocative. What was the focus with them?
It was more about exploring ideas of space and time and the tricky nature of language, knowledge, how we make meaning. The interviews were long, went beyond just the recordings, started broad beauty, wonder, then got more specific, like how we listen to the world.
Okay, so bringing all this together, this huge collection of voices, what were the main themes that kept coming up again and again?
Well, like we said, it digs into social justice through individual lives. So
Mhm.
some really big themes emerged. Desperation and just, the sheer will to survive.
Yeah.
Pain and suffering were definitely recurring themes. And also the huge importance of place, how where you live fundamentally shapes your
And
experience.
always remembering these stories, even the fictional ones, are rooted in those real interviews.
Mm,
The goal is empathy, right? Making the unheard.
exactly that. And it highlights this contrast, doesn't it? Between, say, the relative comfort many of us experience and the simpler, often much harder circumstances where so many of these powerful stories come from. The hope is to kind of bridge that gap in understanding.
And then maybe raise awareness among people who are more privileged about these global realities, the economic disparities.
Right? They focus specifically on people living on very little income and how poverty can just steal childhood. There's this deep hope that sharing these stories might help break those generational cycles.
And it poses that really interesting question, too.
That maybe people facing extreme hardship possess a different kind of wisdom, a perspective that maybe gets lost when the focus is all on material things.
It's a really profound thought. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The project also looked at dreams and aspirations. What did they find there? Was it universal or?
Oh, definitely not universal. The dreams were as diverse as the people themselves. Culture, gender, age, where they lived, even their generation had all played a huge role.
Can you give us some examples? It helps make it real.
Sure, they had like a 15-year-old in Florida whose dream was joining the military. Seemed really into guns, already thinking about future conflicts, like with Iran.
Wow, quite specific.
Yeah. Then compare that to a 24-year-old construction worker in Saigon. His dream,
Right.
owning a motorbike shop. Not for himself, really, but to ease the financial burden on his family. He'd been saving for years,
Totally different motivations.
completely.
Yeah.
And then you had an 89-year-old in Keene, New Hampshire,
Yeah.
just expressing deep worry about where humanity is headed, our sort of self-destructive tendencies.
Those examples really show the spectrum, don't they? From personal ambition to global concern.
Absolutely. And it highlights the difference they noted between, say, ambitions achieving something personally and aspirations, which are more about wanting a different world. Kids wanting to be superheroes versus older people grappling with maybe bigger existential stuff.
So what about the other side of the coin? Fears and challenges. What did they hear globally about that?
Fear is universal, obviously. But how it shows up, what triggers it, that could be very culturally specific. They mentioned how things like language change can even become a source of anxiety, especially after big global events.
Like 9/11, perhaps?
Yeah, they alluded to events like that and the importance of language, not using terms that might generalize or politicize tragedy based on, incomplete understanding of cultures. Being careful not to paint entire groups with the same brush because of the horrific actions of a few.
That's a crucial point. But they also looked at very personal fears.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And how people cope. They shared some really powerful examples. Fati, a nurse in Morocco, 30 years old, deeply afraid of blood because she saw someone die from a gunshot as a child.
Oh, wow. How does she cope as a nurse?
She consciously tries to focus on positive memories, things unrelated to the trauma, and make sure she stays hydrated, interestingly. Then Mena, 19, a student in the DRC, fears loss because of instability, kidnappings, family issues. She uses meditation and positive thinking.
Finding inner resources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even a toddler, Michi in Italy, afraid of the dark after a lamp fell. His parents use reassurance, nightlights, comfort objects for other fears too, like monsters. Simple but effective.
Shows how fear starts young.
It does. And then Akiyuki, an artist in Japan, 36, afraid of public speaking, rejection, feeling like he's strange. He copes by preparing creatively and working on self-acceptance, hoping to find others like him.
These stories really drive home how fear is universal, but the specifics and the coping mechanisms are so individual and sometimes culturally inflected. What about just everyday life? Did voices find common ground there?
It was interesting. They found that within the same location, people's daily lives often had more similarities,
Yeah.
sometimes even across different cultural groups living there, than comparing across distant locations.
So location matters more than culture sometimes for daily routine.
It seemed that way in some respects. They
Oh.
compared someone in Finland, Jan, with someone in the UK, John. Differences in commuting, work tasks, case management versus report writers, even what they did at home, like TV versus computer.
Okay.
But also variations in sleep, how they handled stress. Jan used self-hugging and dark chocolate. Some people really emphasized home, family, friends. Others were much more work-focused and maybe a bit hesitant to share too many details about their personal daily life.
Interesting hesitation.
Yeah, and the researchers themselves noted that maybe the conversations naturally gravitated towards things they could easily discuss across cultures, what they called operant culture and prevailing bias. Maybe the true topic there was the limitation of the communication itself.
That's a really self-aware point. So communication challenges might shape what gets discussed. Did any general patterns emerge, though?
The 7-day week was pretty universal, though some in less developed areas mentioned longer cycles. A lot of people describe taking things day at a time, often linked to daylight hours. Starting the day with cleaning or washing was common. After that, it varied: family time, meals, work, other activities. Not much detail on things like style or etiquette beyond informal language use. Home bathrooms common in developed areas, public ones emerging in big cities elsewhere.
And feelings about community.
Mixed, actually. Some positive impressions of community living. But others, especially in large cities, reported negative experiences feeling watched, harassed, lack of help in emergencies. Yet even some facing difficulties shared a sense of belonging.
Complex picture. Now, they also touched on politics. What did they find looking at political perspectives globally?
They did interviews across about 40 countries over 15 months, found huge diversity, of course, but also some common ground, which fostered respect. A frequent question was, is the world fundamentally an irresponsible place?
Yeah.
That got people thinking about the planet, humanity's path.
And did they talk to politicians directly?
They did. And honestly, most of those interviews were seen as a bit unsatisfactory. Lots of cliches, self-interest. Some just wouldn't participate.
Not surprising, maybe.
Perhaps not. But there were exceptions. People like Kofi Annan, Professor A.V. Naik, Lance Price, Jean-Pierre Raffarin. They apparently engaged seriously with the big questions: climate change, poverty, weapons, even the idea of a stronger global authority.
Good to know some were willing to engage deeply. Moving on to culture itself, understanding it seems central to the project. What were the main insights there?
Well, understanding culture is tricky, right? Especially if you're learning a language. It's fundamental to language learning and teaching. Your own cultural background really shapes how you behave with language.
So it's not just words and grammar, it's the whole package.
Exactly. And the project highlighted that just being incidentally exposed to culture, like often happens in U.S. foreign language classes, isn't enough. You need structured reflection to really develop what they call intercultural competence, basically, being able to navigate different cultural contexts effectively.
Makes sense. You need to actively think about it, compare your own culture to others. Did they study this?
Yeah, one study looked at using ethnographic interviews, like the ones in Voices, to see if it made students more aware of their own culture and others. They used surveys, reflections, analyzed it all.
And did it work?
The implication was yes, that kind of active engagement helps build that awareness.
Fascinating. They even looked at how culture shows up in dreams. That sounds intriguing.
It really is. It started when a colleague noticed their own dreams seemed very tied to their specific cultural background. It made them wonder how much culture and language shape dream content.
So not just random images from the subconscious.
Maybe not entirely. They shared an example, someone dreaming in Indonesian. The symbols, the humor, it was all deeply Indonesian, stuff that wouldn't directly translate or make sense outside that cultural context. Even though the dreamer's education was largely in English, those English symbols were absent in this dream.
Wow. So the dream spoke the culture.
It seemed like it.
Yeah.
And the dream itself was a kind of critique of learning, happening at a very relevant time for the researcher. It just underlined how much culture influences not just the content of dreams, but also how we interpret them.
So dream interpretation needs cultural context too.
Absolutely, like dreaming of the Great Wall, or concepts like virtue or harmony. What that means depends hugely on the cultural background. They even speculated that dreams might reflect deeper societal or market interests, and the calmness of dream characters could suggest a disconnect from waking life. Lots to think about regarding language, dreams, and prior knowledge.
Really makes you think differently about dreams. Okay, circling back quickly, we touched on common fears earlier. Anything more to add there?
Just to reiterate that core point, while the what and how of fear can be cultural, the feeling is universal. The interviews really aim to understand the specifics, the fear itself, its roots, how people manage showing both the diversity and the shared humanity in it.
Got it. And same for daily life variations.
Yeah, just reinforcing the huge range they saw: goals, routines, priorities. The split between home family focus versus work focus was notable, as was that hesitation some had about sharing too many details. still suggests how personal and maybe culturally bound daily life feels.
Right, and political engagement worldwide, we heard those specific examples. Was there an overall takeaway?
The main thing was just the sheer diversity of how people engage or don't engage with politics. It really depends on the country, the system, personal circumstances, access to information. Everything from direct activism, like the Irish environmentalist, to navigating complex systems, like in Jordan, to the more restricted civic duties described in Abu Dhabi. It's definitely not one size fits all.
Clearly not. Okay, let's talk about empathy and understanding. This feels like the heart of the project. What did Voices reveal here?
They positioned empathy and understanding as these like incredibly potent human qualities.
Yeah.
And language is our main tool for building them, even with its limitations in conveying deep emotion.
But it's hard, right? Understanding someone from a totally different background.
It is. And asking how we do that often gets strong reactions. The project acknowledged the risk of filtering out shared humanity through our own biases. They even looked at what young kids across countries think needs clarifying in communication, found similarities but also differences.
And the AI perspective was interesting too.
Yeah, looking at how ChatGPT viewed culture as this intangible bridge passed down through language, art, history, the AI apparently saw deep culture as a delicate delicacy for these sort of invisible conversational spaces.
A delicate delicacy. Huh. It's interesting that even AI gets the nuance. And the power of stories came up again.
Hugely. Personal storytelling across differences was highlighted as a key way to fight prejudice and build empathy. They argued empathy is a choice, something we can cultivate, even standardize as a practice. They talked about operationalizing stories from about self to intentionally build empathy.
So stories, empathy building tools. What about the challenges to understanding diverse perspectives?
Well, they contrasted idealistic notions, like George W. Bush's Compassion Nation, with the reality of how quickly goodwill can evaporate after crises. They cited a horrific example from Asia post-tsunami where divisions reemerged violently.
A sobering reminder.
It is. It shows how easily education and empathy can become careless gifts, and how people can default to seeing others through narrow identity lenses, religion, nation, class, instead of as fellow humans.
And communication itself beyond just the words.
Crucial. They emphasize tone, pauses, all the nonverbal stuff.
Yeah.
And the need to genuinely try to see the other person's view without imposing your own. Aim for complementarity, not conflict.
Practical tips, too.
Yeah, like guiding the conversation gently, encouraging conciseness if someone rambles, or broader thinking if they're too narrow, building attunement through body language, eye contact, matching terminology, but not just fake mirroring. Real connection.
So subtle but important techniques.
And a soft approach to change. Asking general questions first, then defining goals, exploring what's been tried, asking what, when, where, who, questions about exceptions. Paraphrasing is key, summarizing. To confirm understanding, build trust, let the other person lead. It's more effective than just giving advice.
Because people resist being told what to do.
Exactly. If you're mostly asking questions and paraphrasing, it's hard to mislead and builds buy-in. Summarize small agreements. Note when they suggest actions. It creates a roadmap based on discovery, not imposition.
That sounds like a really respectful and effective way to communicate. Okay, let's get into some of the specific case studies, the actual voices from around the world. What was the core idea there?
It started with a simple, powerful question. If you can tell the world one thing, what would it be? They even developed tech to capture voices globally. But they knew the challenge. How do you represent humanity's voice? It's infinitely varied.
So they acknowledged the limits.
Yes. Even a large collection is still just a sample, maybe lacking nuance, but they felt it was urgent with the world shrinking, communication barriers, rising fear and poverty. People were becoming more focused on just their own local concerns.
Barriers distorting how we see each other's values and hopes.
Exactly. So let's look at an example. Country A, probably France.
Okay, what did that voice share?
This was a 22-year-old communications grad. Seemed friendly, adapted to city life in Paris, hadn't traveled much beyond that, aspiring to work in PR.
And her perspective on France.
She thought tourists saw Paris and the Riviera as beautiful, were charmed by things like the old currency and Moujon's, the blue skies. She felt France was famous for the Riviera. Specific dishes, duck confit, escargot, ratatouille wine, and this association with love and art.
What did she want to share culturally?
The French cafe culture. She stressed it's not just about coffee, it's hours of socializing, a real cornerstone.
And anything she thought might seem different to outsiders.
Yeah, she mentioned a perception that French people can seem conceited towards foreigners. Also, the emphasis on attentive restaurant staff, which might be viewed differently elsewhere, and how it's normal to ask waiters about dishes you don't know.
Interesting cultural nuances. What about country B, Italy?
This was Lara, a TV and radio producer. For her, voice meant expression, putting yourself out into the world, which she did through her work directing and producing.
How did she see her role?
Helping others find their voice, teaching camera skills, discussing filming, helping with the final edit. She also reflected on feeling silence sometimes, like when repeating yourself, or just having the power to turn off audio.
A producer's perspective on silence.
Yeah, and guilt over things said in anger or disappointment, wishing she'd been more careful with words. She emphasized mindfulness of language, how meanings change, phrases become mockeries.
Thoughtful. Did you have a visual for her voice?
Black and white. She felt it was the strongest palette, showing complexity through simplicity. She thought color could be beautiful, but deceptively ugly, arguing for embracing diverse realities, not constraining them.
A very artistic viewpoint.
Yeah.
And then country C, the one with the history of conflict.
This was incredibly moving. Someone who survived war, lost loved ones, even attempted suicide, but was stopped and encouraged to help others instead.
Wow. What path did she take?
She initially wanted to fight back, but realized education was the better way to create change. So she became a teacher.
Believing in education's power.
Absolutely. She saw it as more valuable than money long-term, essential for people in poverty to dream and progress. She'd seen it work for her own family members. She deeply believed young people are the future.
How did she teach?
Showed films to all ages, trying to spark critical thinking, problem solving, aiming to make a difference, even a small one. She said education helped her understand the world, solve problems, and that she found the purest love in the classroom.
An amazing story of transformation through education. Gathering these stories must have been tough, though. What were the biggest hurdles?
They really boiled it down to three main things: logistics, cultural sensitivities, and interviewer bias.
Logistics sounds like a nightmare for a global project.
Just getting contact info, communicating across time zones and languages, defining national or ethnic groups respectfully, then dealing with disruptions, civil unrest, health emergencies, elections, canceling interviews. They needed backup plans constantly.
Things you can't control.
Exactly. They had to shift from in-person to phone calls, sometimes in noisy places. Having an international team added complexity potential for miscommunication. Concerns about inexperienced interviewers, handling maybe privileged respondents differently, different attitudes to time and privacy online.
It adds up.
The first attempt apparently faced huge hurdles, only managing interviews on the fifth continent they visited, with small samples. Contacting hosts in Japan and South Africa was hard due to time zones and maybe less enthusiasm there. Later rounds had no precedent for scheduling or turnout. Even contacting their own interviewers was tricky, sometimes with unfamiliar messaging systems.
And the interviews themselves.
Some settings, like exclusive events in Japan or South Africa, were more private, leading to more personal chats, but also less efficient. Lots of back and forth tangents.
Okay, so logistics were huge. What about cultural sensitivities?
This was about being aware and open. On a personal level, it's about your own feelings and actions aligning. Socially, it's about customs, laws, resources, and crucially, being open to new, sometimes discordant voices.
Being ready to listen even when it's unfamiliar or uncomfortable.
Precisely. And global culture shifts unexpectedly, right? Like when Eastern Bloc countries suddenly join the global scene, or harsh debates about human rights reveal local cultural clashes. They called social awareness of cultural sensitivity a grandiose problem.
Big shifts cause ripples.
Yeah, unforeseen political changes like the fall of the Berlin Wall, or how surrogates from Eastern Europe influenced media policy. It raises long-term questions about military presence, tech surveillance, requires constant sensitivity.
And the third challenge, interviewer bias. How did they address that?
They wanted the interviews to be meaningful artifacts, offering listeners a window outside their own bubble, suggesting other ways of knowing. They intentionally avoided a polished, overly edited style.
More raw and real?
Yeah, aiming for information density. They used pseudonyms without obvious origins. Importantly, they resisted forcing everything into neat boxes or eliminating inconsistencies. The transcript was seen as an unmediated record, with its linguistic quirks.
Letting the complexity stand.
Right. They knew purely impartial interviewing could actually distort meaning by ignoring cross-cultural nuances in language and reasoning. They tried to bridge the gap with the audience, even knowing some untranslatable words and depths would be lost. The key was constant shifting, avoiding one authoritative view, letting the different voices splinter and resonate.
That sounds like a very conscious, ethical approach. So what's been the impact? How did the series land?
They evaluated extracts using criteria like topic, originality, focus, length, language. This led to classifying them: comments, witness accounts, inquiries, findings.
What did they find?
A lot of comments were maybe not super original or globally focused, but the findings included analogies, comparisons, examples, new insights, sometimes skeptical or angry, but often quite locally focused, which wasn't seen as a fault of the interviewees, just their perspective. They also classified comments by tight apricot. Many were critical of specific issues, showing high-order thinking.
And how did audiences actually receive it?
They used theories about media reception hegemony, symbolic distancing, cultural proximity to analyze how global content interacts with local audiences in different social contexts. There's a whole debate about satellite TV's impact, global media versus local audiences, areas for more research.
And the educational use was a big surprise, right?
It's totally unexpected. After it became publicly available, teachers just started using it across different subjects, especially during the pandemic.
How were they using it?
All sorts of ways. Introducing Spanish language to high schoolers, scaffolding language learning by gradually removing subtitles, showing university students English beyond just written texts, adding context, behind-the-scenes stuff. A drama class in Hong Kong used it for stage reading. Even international organizations used it to discuss cross-cultural parenting.
Wow, really versatile.
Yeah, the researchers gained a lot of insight into how it was being used, the successes, and maybe the oddities, too.
What about community engagement beyond education?
They decided to connect more deeply with participants, doing follow-up interviews in various ways: phone, conferences, email. One researcher participated as a discussant at a conference about community engagement, focusing on accountability for powerful nations and the impact of small actions. That led to a connection with someone named Eloise, who invited them into the project.
So it sparked ongoing connections. What's next? Where is Voices of the World heading?
They've been disseminating the interviews through broadcasts, multimedia exhibits, educational materials, always aiming to spark discussion. They're preparing something called First Thoughts, an educational program focused on future hopes for international public TV.
Expanding the reach.
Definitely. Creating an electronic version for global educational use. Using tech to cross borders, expand consciousness, understand social differences, imagine new ways of being together. They're planning an interactive event, also called Voices of the World, for public outreach, video excerpts, discussions, building community, exploring media representation.
Sounds ambitious. Are they adding more voices?
Yes. After the first edition, which focused on New Zealand, they called for contributions. That led to collections from Helsinki, an Asian group, the Americas, the Pacific.
Wow, truly global now.
Inspired by someone named Henry Liu, the goal became this unprecedented international effort to bridge divides through writing for a better, more peaceful world. Involved 18 nations, offering diverse views on things like 9/11, focusing on humanity and understanding over judgment. A really fresh perspective.
And technology's role in the future.
But they see huge potential, enhancing student-centered projects, connecting with people far away, letting students become educators, tools like video, audio, podcasts, but integrated purposefully, not just tech for tech's sake.
Making learning active and authentic.
Exactly. Fostering collaboration, peer teaching. It aligns with good language teaching, focusing on culture, using research questions, having a real audience, letting students direct things. Tech facilitates inquiry in real-world ways. But implementation is key. It needs to be grounded in content and pedagogy.
And collaborations with organizations.
That's a big part of the plan. Partnering with schools, universities, charities, NGOs, arts organizations, anyone who can help widen the reach.
What would that look like?
Publishing excerpts, translation, maybe donating proceeds. It's mutually beneficial. Organizations get content. The work reaches more people. They're mapping out potential partners now.
How are they framing the message?
Focusing on the civic aspect, the need for awareness of diverse perspectives in any global discussion without pushing one single view. Raising awareness across society, art, education, communication, regulation is vital for tackling global challenges. Every voice matters. They're doing a thorough mapping of sectors and organizations for this.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. It's clear Voices of the World has been and continues to be an incredibly rich project.
It really has been rewarding, and it unfolded over, about 10 months of activity initially. The depth and richness of the responses, the clarity and vulnerability people shared, it exceeded expectations.
And the plan is still to share more.
Yes, definitely. publishing a selection in a book, expanding beyond the initial interviews to capture an even broader range of global voices. The excitement about sharing these responses remains really high.
It really taps into that fundamental need, doesn't it, to understand how others see the world.
Absolutely. The initial responses showed this unexpected coherence, this wisdom emerging from connecting individual perspectives to the
Yeah.
wider world. It just deepens that desire to understand.
So, a final thought for everyone listening. As you've heard about all these different voices, which perspective, which story resonated most strongly with you? And maybe ask yourself, what does that resonance tell you about your own view of the world, your own understanding of this incredibly complex human tapestry? Something to definitely mull over.